It is perhaps one of the most romantic and chivalrous stories to come out of the horrors of World War II. A meeting between an American heavy bomber, severely damaged by flak and enemy fighters, with most of her crew severely wounded, and a German fighter ace tasked with defending his fatherland from the onslaught of the Allied bombing campaign. The date was the 20th of December 1943. Like many December days in Britain, it dawned cold and cloudy. At RAF Kimbolton, B-17s of the 379th Bombardment Group were lining up to take off for a mission that would take them deep into German territory. Amongst them was a bomber nicknamed Ye Old Pub, and commanding her was 21-year-old Lieutenant Charles Brown. It was to be his first combat mission in command of the Flying Fortress, and flying with him was a crew of 9 others. Second Lieutenant Spencer Luke, co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Albert Sadok, navigator, Second Lieutenant Robert Andrews, bombardier and radio operator, Sergeant Bertrand Colum, flight engineer and turret gunner, Sergeant Richard Pechout, radio operator, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, tail gunner, Sergeant Lloyd Jennings, waist gunner, Sergeant Alex Yelasenko, waist gunner, and Sergeant Samuel Blackford, who is the ball turret gunner. Hundreds of miles away, Oberlieutenant Franz Stigler was preparing for another arduous day of defending the Reich. He was a pilot belonging to Jagdgeschwader 27, a veteran of intense air combat over Africa and then Europe when his group was pulled back for home defense. He was, in fact, an ace, a protege of Gustav Rödel, and by the 20th December he was 3 victories away from the Knight's Cross. Since the beginning of 1943, he had been kept busy defending the skies of Germany against what they called the Big American Four Motors, and he was now an experienced bomber hunter. In what was becoming more and more a common sight, the skies of Germany soon rumbled to the engine noise of these 4 motors. Their target today was the city of Bremen. On this particular day, Bremen was hit by multiple bomber groups. The city was an important industrial target, and as such it was heavily defended by hundreds of flak batteries. The sky was already dense with flak when Charles Brown and his crew reached the bombing target, the hornet's nest having been kicked by elements of the 392nd Bomb Group earlier that day. However, before they could drop their bombs, the B-17 took a nasty hit from the flak. The shrapnel injured some of the crew members, damaged the controls, disabled the number 2 engine, gave a shrewd knock to number 4, and shattered the plexiglass nose. In this damaged state, Brown was unable to keep formation, and the bomber soon dropped back, becoming a straggler. It was then that things went from bad to worse, and the crew of the B-17 found themselves under air attack by over a dozen German fighters. A mix of Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s began to harass and pepper the bomber. The oxygen, hydraulic, and electrical systems were soon damaged, and the bomber lost a significant chunk off its tail stabilizer. The effectiveness of the bomber's defensive guns was soon reduced by exposure to the extreme cold, and almost all of the crew in the rear of the bomber were injured by enemy fire, the tail gunner succumbing to his wounds. During this heated engagement, Charlie Brown maintained control of the aircraft despite a growing lack of oxygen and taking a bullet fragment to his right shoulder. He put the wounded bomber through a series of extremely aggressive maneuvers to throw the German fighters off their aim. At one point, the lack of oxygen took its toll, and he momentarily lost consciousness during a particularly steep maneuver. He regained consciousness in time to stop the bomber slamming into a dense forest below, leveling out at just around 1,000 feet. At this point, the German fighters had pulled away, no doubt thinking that the bomber was in its death plunge, and the wounded crew of the B-17 were left alone. After administering emergency first aid and stabilizing the most critical wounds, there had been some appalling shrapnel damage to the rear of the bomber, it was eventually decided to try and fly the bomber back to England, as it was thought that some of the crew were too seriously injured to survive bailing out from the aircraft. It is here that Franz Stigler enters the story. He had already had a busy day of it, having already intercepted a formation of B-17s earlier on in the day, and claiming 2 more aerial kills in the process. In fact, his 109 was still undergoing repairs when they caught sight of the lone B-17 flying overhead. After hurriedly completing the refueling and rearming of his 109, Franz took off in pursuit of the lone bomber. His curiosity was raised when the bomber seemed to take no evasive or defensive action as he closed the distance. He decided to risk a closer look, preparing to avoid turret fire at any moment, but the tail gun of the B-17 remained limp, and Franz got well within dangerous range of the B-17 when he noticed the shocking state that the bomber was in. The rear of the aircraft was riddled with bullet holes and flak damage, part of the tail was missing, and 2 of the engines were smoking badly. In fact, he could clearly see inside parts of the airframe and found himself looking at some of the crew members. A few of them were lying down. He didn't know if they were dead or wounded, but the bomber was in no fit state to defend itself, let alone stay in the air. Franz Stigler found himself in a difficult position. His duty to his country called him to fire upon the bomber and send it burning into the ground, but his conscience as a fellow pilot called louder. It was something emphasized by his mentor, Gustav Rödel, who had once remarked, "If I ever see or hear of you shooting a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." To Franz, the battered and dying B-17 was essentially now a glorified parachute for her crew. Her abilities as a fighting vehicle had long been compromised, and she was becoming closer to a flying coffin than a functioning aircraft. Despite his actions being a court-martial offense, Franz held his fire and moved up alongside the bomber. It's difficult to imagine Charlie Brown's surprise when he looked outside to find a Bf-109 flying level with his cockpit, and the German pilot gesturing wildly with his hands. Franz Stigler was desperately trying to convince Brown to land his plane at a German airfield and surrender, or at least allow him to escort them over to neutral Sweden. Unfortunately, Charlie Brown and his crew could not understand the signals of their German escort. Realizing that the Americans were not getting his message, Franz decided to fly his 109 alongside the B-17 as it made its way out of enemy territory, so that the German anti-aircraft guns would not fire upon it from risk of hitting their own aircraft. Brown and his crew were still unsure of the exact intentions of the Bf-109 that had become their strange consort. Eventually, they exited German airspace, and he did not want to be followed any further, so he ordered his dorsal turret gunner to aim at the German aircraft, but to hold fire. Franz had already been mulling over the idea of leaving the bomber to its journey home. He was in constant fear of being discovered by other German aircraft, and when he saw the gunner aim at him within near point-blank range, he took it as his cue to leave. He returned to his airfield and never said a word of the incident, serving out the rest of the war with the secret held close to his chest. Miraculously, Brown managed to fly the damaged B-17 across the North Sea to safely land in England. He landed Ye Old Pub at RAF Seething in southeast Norfolk, and debriefed their strange encounter to the officers there. After this, he was sworn to secrecy not to repeat the tale, as Bomber Command didn't want their crews thinking that some of the German fighters might be merciful to damaged bombers trying to get home. Almost 5 decades later, Charlie was interviewed about his experiences in the war, and the incident with the strange German fighter revived itself in his memory, prompting him to begin a long search for his old saviour. After 4 years, Franz Stigler was located in Canada. The pair had a lengthy phone call where each filled in the blanks of the other's story, and they met for the first time in 1990 and immediately became close friends, forming a bond akin to brotherhood. In the subsequent years following their reunion, Charlie and Franz spent time travelling through North America to tell their story. They often visited aviation clubs, museums, and many military units. Their message was a simple one: enemies are better off as friends. Franz Stigler passed away in March 2008, and Charlie Brown passed away later on that year in November. Prior to his death, the US Air Force had conducted a full investigation and review of the events of December 20th, 1943, and found that the officials at the time had handled it poorly. Charlie, along with the surviving members of his crew, was awarded the Air Force Cross, the nation's second highest medal for valor. Their story about this incident, and about their time in the war in general, is brilliantly documented in a book called A Higher Call. It's a fantastic read, drawing from interviews of both Charlie and Franz, and also includes some excellent observations on the war and pre-established prejudices by the author. You can get it in printed form or as an ebook, and I think it's currently available for free if you have Kindle Unlimited. It's definitely recommended reading if you're at all interested in World War II history, and it showcases one of the many private moments of humanity that occurred in a time of great chaos and inhumanity.